Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the NAM's COVID-19 media call. My name is Rob Damshin. I'm the Senior Director for Strategic Communications at the NAM. I'll be serving as moderator today. Thank you all for joining us. In a moment, you'll hear from NAM President and CEO Jay Timmons. We're also joined by Eric Newhouse, the Senior Vice President for Policy at the NAM. But before that, just a couple notes. This call is on the record and is being recorded by our team as well. Following Jay's opening statement, we'll take as many questions as we can given the time available. When your question is accepted, I'll announce your name and unmute your line. To ask a question, please submit in the Q&A box in the lower right corner of the platform. For those of you that dialed in via telephone, due to platform limitations, please email mediarequests@nam.org with your question, outlet, and the telephone number you're using, and I'll announce your question for you. When you're called on, be sure your telephone is also unmuted, or if connected via VoIP, that you have a microphone that you can unmute on your end. Now I'll turn it over to Jay Timmons for an opening statement.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. As we all know, late last night or early this morning, the Senate acted boldly and in a bipartisan way to approve its COVID-19 relief bill. Now, we've been working for weeks to ensure many of manufacturers' key priorities were included. And several weeks ago, we were out of the gate with our COVID-19 policy action plan recommendations for both health and safety, as well as economic resilience. The CARES Act includes proposals from our plan that include new loan programs to help manufacturers through these difficult times, a new tax credit for employers who continue to pay workers during periods that a business is forced to temporarily close. It allows workers facing reduced hours to receive unemployment benefits, which will help maintain that critical employee-employer relationship. It retroactively allows businesses to use tax losses to offset prior year income, provides financial flexibility for workers by waiving penalties for distributions from retirement accounts, and it clarifies liability protections for respiratory protective devices. It also expands utilization of telehealth services and suspends contributions to pension plans for calendar year 2020. The bill also takes key steps from the NAM plan by increasing the maximum amount of tax deductions for interest on business loans, and by creating incentives through loan forgiveness for small manufacturers to retain their employees during this crisis. And quite frankly, with 90% of our members being small and medium-sized enterprises, I think that is absolutely the most critical portion of this legislation. We're going to continue working with congressional and administration leaders on not only this package, but also future packages to protect our people, our economy, and our country. Today, we also wanted to give you an update on how the National Association of Manufacturers and indeed our entire industry is responding to this COVID-19 crisis. Across America, manufacturers are indeed mobilizing. They're stepping up. They're stepping up to supply desperately needed healthcare equipment. They're stepping up to offer to repurpose their facilities. They're stepping up to keep supplying the essentials for daily life. And they're stepping up to keep our employees and our communities safe. The NAM is working all across the federal government with the White House, FEMA, HHS, OMB, FDA, DHS, and of course Congress, as well as with manufacturers to help provide coordination for this effort to identify supply. It's been said that this is like a war, and it certainly is. And in World War II, we all remember that manufacturers were the arsenal of democracy. Today, manufacturers are called on once again, but this time to arm our healthcare workers in the battle with this deadly virus. But it goes beyond the front lines of our hospitals, our grocery stores. They must continue to be stocked. Our electricity needs to keep running. Our devices must keep us connected. Our lives may be socially distant, but life does go on. And that means manufacturers must keep making daily life possible for all Americans. So working closely with our state association partners, We've sent a clear message to governors and local officials. Let us keep operating. Let us keep aiding this country and the world. Manufacturers, all manufacturing in the supply chain, it's absolutely essential. I got one example I'd like to share with you because I think it's an outstanding story. Marlin Steel in Baltimore, and that's a company that's led by Drew Greenblatt, who is a member of the NAM's executive committee. Well, they're a wire products manufacturer. So some elected officials may look at that and think, well, this really isn't an essential business. Well, last Friday, Marlin got an emergency order to make wire racks for test tubes for COVID-19 testing. They don't make wire test tube racks. They've never done that before. But Drew and his team volunteered to work all weekend to get that done, repurpose their facility. And guess what? They shipped out that order by Sunday afternoon. Now that's an example of extraordinary effort to help deal with this crisis. It's the kind of story that we're hearing over and over across the country on a large and small scale, from Marlin Steel to Ford partnering with GM and GE to build ventilators, as well as GM. We're also seeing people step up to make more respirators and masks. We're seeing Toyota and Honda offer their expertise to help repurpose certain manufacturing lines. We are very, very grateful for their efforts. We're also grateful for our association partners. And I want to give you a few examples of how state manufacturing associations and our state partners are stepping up. The Ohio Manufacturers Association, that's led by Eric Birkland, they work closely with Governor DeWine to avoid the shutdown of critical manufacturing components. Mark Denzler and the Illinois Manufacturers Association, they took a similar approach with Governor Pritzker. Lance Hastings, the CEO of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, he and CMTA worked closely with Governor Newsom to help the governor incorporate guidance from DHS that superseded many problematic county orders. CMTA is also working on implementation and enforcement. And in a great model of collaboration, Jeff Freeman, the CEO of the Consumer Brands Association, well, he brought together dozens of associations to get regulatory certainty and address specific needs to keep the food supply chain moving and safe. Now, in our work with federal officials, the NAM is not in a position to be able to identify need, but what we can find are the people with the know-how to meet those needs when they are identified. We went out to our members asking them to tell us what supplies or component parts that they could make. Our Council of Manufacturing Associations did exactly the same, reaching out to their 270 association members. We quickly heard from more than 1,600 companies who were willing to step up and keep this country healthy. We're working every day to coordinate so that when a company offers to donate or to make supplies, FEMA and others can get those supplies to where they need to go. Here are some really great examples that I want to share with you. One company provided 75,000 gloves, 3,000 Tyvek suits, and almost 20,000 face masks. And those were picked up by the government and sent directly to New York City. Another supplied 250,000 gowns and 250,000 over-the-shoe booties for FEMA to deliver. And another manufacturer had 38 million gloves. And we helped them get through some pretty significant red tape so those gloves could be flown to FEMA and other critical medical destinations. In just a couple of days, we've had 116 companies stepping up to provide gloves, 106 offering protective units, and 116 with over-the-shoe booties. So the response is strong and it's growing. We've also been working with and have been instrumental in getting more clear guidance from the CDC and other agencies about how manufacturers can continue to operate safely in this environment. So these really are unprecedented times. I know that we all know this and kind of goes without saying, but a message from manufacturers is that we're all in this together and we're going to do everything we can to continue to be part of the solution. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and I'll turn it back to Rob.
Thank you, Jay. The first question comes in from Theo Meyer, Politico. Theo, go ahead.
Hey, Theo.
Hi, thanks for making time to do this.
Thank you.
Was just curious what guidance you are giving manufacturers who are thinking about applying for the Treasury loan provisions in the bill.
So we haven't gotten to that point yet. Obviously, implementation is going to be of that particular provision is going to be critical, and it won't surprise you to know that we've already had many questions along that line. As soon as we are able to get the appropriate guidance from Treasury and other federal sources, we will get that guidance out to manufacturers. We will be sure that you are on the receiving end of that information as well, Theo. Next question.
And the next question comes in via email from Andrew Edgecliffe Johnson, Financial Times. He's asking, would the NAM like to see the Defense Production Act applied? What advantages and disadvantages would it have for manufacturers mobilizing to supply needed equipment?
Thank you, Angela. I think that's a great question, and it also won't surprise you that that's one that we've been getting quite a bit. And look, I'm just going to shoot straight with you. I'm completely agnostic on this front. We believe manufacturers are able to step up and supply the needs that this country is facing. Obviously, we would have liked to have gotten an earlier start at this, but we are producing as much as we possibly can. And whether the DPA is in effect or not, you know, manufacturers aren't going to be compelled to do the right thing because we already are. That said, if there is a way for DPA to be helpful, for instance, there are some provisions in DPA that I think everybody's trying to sort out right now that might actually provide some funds or grants or loans to manufacturers who are repurposing their facilities, so that it makes it easier for them to cross that rather significant financial hurdle in doing so. So I've also heard that there's a possibility that could be applied on a case-by-case basis. We'll have to see how that continues to evolve. But the fact of the matter is, manufacturers are doing everything we can every single day to meet the significant needs for personal protective equipment, medical supplies, and also making sure that the food supply is working appropriately. Next question, Rob.
And the next question comes from Sean Donnan, Bloomberg. Sean, go ahead.
Hi, Sean.
Hi, how are you? Can you just give us an idea of what percentage of your membership have reduced production and what percentage have implemented layoffs? We hear lots of stories out there from companies, individual companies, but you've got a pretty good view of the sector as a whole.
Yeah, I actually wish I could give you some very specific data, and I was actually asking for that information earlier today as well when I saw the unemployment numbers come out. But look, or the unemployment filings. So look, I have anecdotal evidence as well, and what I can tell you is we have heard from many of our manufacturers that they are hanging on as long as they possibly can and keeping their employees on the payroll. They don't want to see that employer-employee relationship severed, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that we were so pleased to see many of the provisions within the CARES Act, because there were incentives in there to maintain that employee-employer relationship. Before this all began, as you well know, Sean, we had 500,000 open jobs in manufacturing. That's of course not the case today. But what it does say is that, assuming this is a V curve, which I believe all of us hope is the case, we're going to have a need very quickly to ramp up hiring in our facilities for any of those facilities that may have been shut down during this crisis or that need to expand operations. I'm confident. I have a great deal of confidence in the resiliency of manufacturers in this country to ramp up very quickly. But what we don't want is to have yet another crisis of a shortage of skilled workers. So maintaining that employer-employee relationship is absolutely vital to most manufacturers, and that's what we've seen in so many cases. In fact, we've seen some manufacturers, as you well know, actually hiring up to be able to meet the needs of the federal government and localities and local hospitals and medical professionals for the life-saving healthcare supplies and equipment. Rob, next question.
All right. The next question is Kathy Kiley, PBS. Kathy, go ahead.
Kathy. Kathy, I'm not hearing you if you're on there.
Right. Kathy actually sent in her question.
That would do it.
How do you think this crisis will increase the demand for skilled advanced manufacturing workers across the country, perhaps changing our reliance? So we'll see a resurgence of training and hiring.
I'm sorry, Rob, you broke up after reliance.
How do you think this crisis will increase the demand for skilled advanced manufacturing workers across the country, perhaps changing our reliance? So will we see a resurgence of training and hiring?
Oh, yeah, it's very similar to my response to my last question. I do believe we're going to see a resurgence, and there will be a lot of pent-up demand. There will be a lot of manufacturers who are going to need to ramp up production. I do believe that. That said, again, we had 500,000 open jobs, and with all conditions being equal, if this had not occurred, within just a few years, the number of open jobs in manufacturing would rise to 2.4 million open jobs. That is the work that our Manufacturing Institute does every single day through the programs that, before this all hit, the programs that encouraged more women to enter the manufacturing workforce with their Step Ahead initiative. The Heroes Make America program, which was a partnership that the Manufacturing Institute had with the Department of Defense to train military personnel who were transitioning out of the military and train them for jobs in the manufacturing sector. There are a lot of programs that the Institute has been working on to make sure that we're able to meet those demands in the future. But to your direct question, I believe that need is going to increase even more, which will make the work of the Manufacturing Institute even that much more critical and vital. Rob, do you have another question for us?
Yeah, the next one comes from Kristen Holmes, CNN. She's asking, can you tell us about the conversations you've had with FEMA regarding the agency taking over the supply chain to make it easier for manufacturers?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristen. That has been the most productive conversations that we've had. We worked very closely with Dr. Peter Navarro at the White House early on in this crisis, and he was helping us to move supply that we identified to areas of the country that most desperately needed. That operation is now being expanded and ramped up by FEMA, and we've been working very closely with Admiral John Palachuk, who is in charge of the supply side of this operation, and so supply chain portion of the operation. So we're working very closely. We've sent out a survey to our members. We are updating that survey every few days with new information and new guidance that we're getting from FEMA about additional supplies and equipment that they need, with additional information on specs as those specs become available. As you can imagine, you can't just make masks. They have to be spec'd out to a certain standard, and that information needs to get to our manufacturers. We're going to be releasing the next version of that survey soon in coordination with the Business Roundtable, and Josh Bolton and I have been working together to make sure that we can get the right information in there to be of most help to FEMA as that moves forward. A gentleman on our team, Herb Grant, is managing these operations. We have repurposed many members of the NAM team in Washington and in fact across the country who are working remotely to be able to help identify with manufacturers what their capabilities are. As I mentioned, there were 1,600 responses to our first couple of surveys. It takes a lot of time and effort to go through and make sure that each of those responses is viable. We don't want to send information to the federal government from a manufacturer that may have all the best intentions, but actually doesn't have the capability to either produce those products that are so necessary or to repurpose their facilities appropriately to make those products. But we have been able to identify hundreds that can do that. And in close coordination with FEMA, Admiral Palachek and his team, we're starting to move these supplies much more rapidly. Rob?
And we'll have our last question from Steve Tolikin, Plastics News. Steve, go ahead.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Jay. Hi. Thanks for doing this. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, and I want to tell you, Tony Ratajkowski has been a great partner in all of this as they're working to make sure that the supply chain is going strong in the plastics area. But go ahead.
Oh, okay, sure. My question is, to what extent are you hearing about manufacturers having issues with employees not feeling safe and wanting to come in and impacting production? To what extent is that an issue?
So we are hearing some anecdotal evidence of that, Steve, and I think it's a very, very good question, and I'm really glad that you asked it. It is why we have asked for very specific guidance from the Centers for Disease Control. We've been getting some of that guidance back, but we still need some more, because the one thing, the very first priority, I should say, the very first priority for manufacturers is to make sure that our workers, their families, and their communities are safe and healthy. Period. Stop. Once we can ensure that that occurs, obviously we're going to continue to ramp up production. The Vice President's office through the Coronavirus Task Force is making sure that we have very, very clear written guidance from the CDC. We're hopeful that that information will get to us today, as a matter of fact, so that we can get that out to manufacturers. And that guidance would include, proper cleaning protocols. What happens if somebody tests positive? How do you have to close down certain portions of the facility? What are the cleaning protocols if that occurs? Most of this is, quite frankly, something that manufacturers do every single day in making sure that their operations are safe and healthy. But it doesn't hurt, obviously, to have additional guidance from the CDC. So we're anxious to get that information. But we're also, the other thing that we're doing is we're making sure that we share best practices. We had a call with 3,000 manufacturers last Friday. We had another call yesterday with several more thousand manufacturers. We are sharing those best practices so that everyone is up to date on the best ways to keep their workforce and their workplaces safe and healthy. I know that's the last question, but Rob, before we sign off, just let me say, as someone who is working with the incredible heroes that are on the front lines of this crisis, our nation's manufacturers, I want to thank everybody in the media for the critical, crucial role that you're playing. I realize that these are tough times. I realize that these are times when tempers flare, but there is no more important freedom than we enjoy than the First Amendment to our Constitution. And I want to personally thank you on behalf of the nation's 13 million manufacturers and their families. I want to thank you for all you do to protect our nation's freedoms and to get the news and the word out. Thank you all for joining us today.
Jay, thank you. That concludes today's call. Thank you for joining us. We'll continue publishing manufacturing-based COVID-19 resources at nam.org/coronavirus. You can also contact our communications team anytime, media requests at nam.org. I want to be a resource to you guys. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you, everybody.